What if the countries shaping the future of global politics aren't the United States, China, or Russia, but the ones you hear less about? Brazil, India, Indonesia, Turkey, and others, the so-called middle powers, are stepping off the sidelines to rewrite the rules of the global order. In a fragmented, multipolar world, they might just hold the key to holding it all together or tearing it further apart. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Global Insights. I'm Noah Zerbe. I'm a professor of global politics at California State Polytechnic University Humboldt. And today we're looking at one of the most important and underappreciated stories of international relations, the rise of the middle powers. For most of the last century, global politics was framed around the great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and later the unipolar dominance of the US after 1991. More recently, the focus has shifted to a new great power rivalry between the United States and China. But outside of that spotlight, a growing number of states are quietly but powerfully reshaping the global system. Countries like Indonesia, Brazil, South Korea, Turkey, Pakistan, Vietnam, South Africa, and so on don't fit neatly into the traditional power hierarchy. They're not hegemons, they don't dominate militarily, but they matter a lot. These countries are middle powers, countries with enough economic, diplomatic, or regional clout to influence global affairs, but without the full spectrum dominance of a superpower. And today they're more active, more ambitious, and more assertive than ever. Think of it as a spectrum. On the one end, you have superpowers like the United States and China with global military and economic reach. On the other, you have smaller states with limited influence. Middle powers exist in that crucial space in between, too big to be ignored, but not big enough to dominate. Middle powers don't act as a unified bloc, and they're not always pulling in the same direction. Some are stabilizing forces, championing multilateral cooperation and regional diplomacy. Others are geopolitical wildcards, pursuing military buildups, regional dominance, or strategic ambiguity. Some, like India and Brazil, do both, promoting cooperation on global issues while simultaneously pursuing assertive regional strategies. And with the US and China focused on each other, a power vacuum may now be emerging, giving these states the room and the incentive to forge their own path. So, in this episode, we're going to explore how middle powers are reinventing multilateralism in the absence of great power leadership, acting as both stabilizers for the system and destabilizers in regional conflicts, and using economic statecraft and strategic autonomy to chart their own course through a polarized world. We'll look at how this emerging trend challenges traditional models of power in international relations, and at why understanding middle powers may be the key to understanding the future of global politics. Let's explore three key ways middle powers are reshaping global politics. And let's start with the idea of multilateralism, the process of coordinating foreign policy between multiple countries, often through international institutions, in order to handle global problems collectively. Now, multilateralism has long been the domain of great powers. Think about the UN Security Council or the G7 or the post-World War II Bretton Woods institutions. These were created and largely dominated by the United States and its allies to manage global security, finance, and trade. But today that system is under strain. The UN is paralyzed on many issues, the World Trade Organization is gridlocked, the climate change regime struggles to meet basic funding commitments, and great powers, especially the US and China, are increasingly pursuing unilateral or bilateral strategies rather than global consensus. Enter the middle powers. These are countries that don't have military dominance or the global reach of a superpower, but they have something else. Diplomatic flexibility, regional credibility, and strong stakes in a functioning global order. Think of states like Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, or Norway. They don't usually throw their weight around militarily, but they show up, they negotiate, they build coalitions, and increasingly they're using that soft power to reshape how multilateralism works in a fragmented world. At the 2024 World Economic Forum in Davos, Indonesian diplomat Dino Patidijal captured this perfectly. He said, "In the 21st century, the world order will be shaped not by the great powers or major powers, but by the proliferation of middle powers." That's a bold claim, but it's not wrong. We're seeing new alignments between middle powers across both the global south and the global north, including partnerships like Australia and India or South Africa and Brazil. These alliances aren't driven by ideology or bloc politics. They're driven by shared interests and the desire to avoid being trapped in a new Cold War between Washington and Beijing. And here's the thing, this isn't fragmentation, it's diversification. Multilateralism used to mean the UN or NATO or the G20, but now it also means ASEAN, the African Union, the BRICS, Pacific Alliance, the IBSA Dialogue Forum, and countless ad hoc coalitions of the willing. These new networks are more flexible, more representative, and in many cases, more effective. So we've seen how middle powers are stepping up to revitalize multilateralism. But here's where it gets more complicated. Middle powers can stabilize the global system, but they can also destabilize it. This might seem contradictory, but it's a crucial point. In international relations, we often focus on the big players, the great powers like the US, China, or Russia. But history shows us that many global crises aren't triggered by great powers directly. They're triggered by what political scientists call dangerous dyads. In plain terms, dangerous dyads refer to conflicts between smaller or mid-sized states, especially when those conflicts risk pulling in larger powers. Think about the tensions between Austria-Hungary and Serbia before World War I, or between North and South Korea in the 1950s, or the Syrian civil war, or Libya, or the Balkans. And of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine shows how a regional conflict, even one initiated by a great power, can trigger instability on a massive scale. In each case, a regional or mid-level conflict escalated or threatened to escalate into something much broader. That's the destabilizing potential of middle powers. Let's take Turkey as a case study. Under President Erdogan, Turkey has become one of the most assertive middle powers in the world. It's a NATO member, yes, but it's also a buyer of Russian weapons systems. It's maintained relations with both Russia and Ukraine. It has troops in Syria, ties to militias in Libya, and ambitions in the South Caucasus. It blocked Sweden's NATO membership for over a year, and yet it also brokered the Black Sea grain deal, one of the most successful pieces of wartime diplomacy in Ukraine. So, is Turkey stabilizing or destabilizing? The answer is both. It's a NATO ally that buys Russian missiles, a peacemaker that wages proxy wars. It's a geopolitical hinge, and which way it swings can change the entire strategic landscape. Or take India, which has deep ties to the United Nations through the Quad and tech cooperation, but also maintains strong military and economic ties with Russia even after the invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, India has historically been a leader in the global south, a founder of the non-aligned movement, and a key player in the BRICS bloc. Its foreign policy reflects a kind of strategic autonomy that resists binary choices. Now, from one perspective, this kind of hedging makes middle powers unpredictable. They're not locked into alliances the way great powers expect them to be, and that can complicate diplomacy. Think of it like investing. You don't put all your money into one stock. India isn't putting all of its diplomatic capital into Team America or Team China. It's diversifying its portfolio of partnerships to maximize returns and minimize risk, no matter which superpower comes out on top. And from another perspective, that's exactly what makes middle powers so important. They often have the legitimacy and the flexibility to move between camps, especially in a world where bloc politics is making a comeback. The danger, though, is when regional rivalries between middle powers escalate. Think of the tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or between India and Pakistan, or Azerbaijan and Armenia, or Vietnam and China. These rivalries can draw in great powers, not because of formal alliances, but because of entangled interests in trade, energy, military partnerships, or regional influence. In short, we need to pay more attention to middle powers, not just as peace builders or joiners, but as actors with their own agendas and sometimes their own conflicts. Because in a world where great power confrontation is a constant risk, the trigger points may actually lie elsewhere, in the ambitions and alignments of states that don't dominate the system but still have a shake in it. We've looked at how middle powers are reshaping multilateralism and how they can both stabilize and destabilize the global order. But perhaps the most important trend right now is this. Middle powers are increasingly pursuing strategic autonomy. They're carving out space for independent action, not just diplomatically, but economically. Let's break this down. In IR, strategic autonomy refers to a state's ability to define and pursue its own national interest without being overly constrained by the agendas of more powerful actors. This used to be the realm of non-alignment during the Cold War, but today it's less about neutrality and more about maneuvering, especially in a global system that's increasingly pulled in opposite directions by the US-China rivalry. Middle powers aren't interested in joining Team America or Team Beijing. Instead, they're saying, we'll work with both of you, but on our own terms. Take Indonesia, which has become a textbook case of economic statecraft. Indonesia controls the world's largest reserves of nickel, a key input for electric vehicle batteries. In 2020, it banned the export of raw nickel to foreign firms to invest in local processing and refining. The result? Massive investment, mostly from China, but also from the West. Indonesia now accounts for about half of global nickel extraction, and its nickel export earnings jumped from $3 billion to $30 billion in just 3 years. This is strategic autonomy in action. Indonesia didn't just accept its role in the global supply chain, it redefined it. And that's exactly what many middle powers are trying to do. Another example? Mexico and Vietnam have become critical connector economies between China and the United States, benefiting from trade rerouting and nearshoring efforts. But they're also facing growing pressure from both sides, Washington demanding reshoring and higher tariffs, and Beijing offering deeper investment partnerships. Across Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, middle powers are being squeezed from both sides. On the one hand, Trump-era tariffs are returning, threatening their access to U.S. markets. On the other, China's manufacturing overcapacity is flooding their markets with cheap goods, threatening local industry. So what do? They hedge, they negotiate better terms, and increasingly, they form their own trade agreements and investment frameworks, like the African Continental Free Trade Area, Mercosur's deal with the European Union, or the BRICS Plus development partnerships. Some are also using their leverage in critical minerals, lithium in Zimbabwe, cobalt in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, rare earths in Namibia, to demand downstream investment, local job creation, and infrastructure in return. This is not aid dependency, it's geoeconomic bargaining, and it's a growing source of power and influence for the middle powers. But it's not without its risks. As global competition intensifies, great powers are weaponizing economic statecraft through sanctions, export controls, and investment restrictions. And middle powers, despite their growing influence, remain vulnerable to secondary sanctions, retaliatory tariffs, or being cut out of tech ecosystems altogether. That's the tightrope they're walking. But here's the deeper point. Middle powers aren't just adapting to the new global economy. They're remaking it, rewriting trade rules, leveraging critical resources, and forcing both the United States and China to compete for their partnership. In a world where traditional power is measured by missiles and markets, middle powers are showing that agency matters, that sovereignty isn't just about borders, it's about leverage. And increasingly, these states are using that leverage to build a world that works on their terms, not just those of the superpowers. So what do we take away from all this? Middle powers are no longer just a supporting cast in world politics. They're not balancing between great powers or tagging along in multilateral institutions. They're shaping the script. From Indonesia's nickel strategy to Turkey's conflict diplomacy, from Brazil's leadership in climate negotiations to South Africa's role in BRICS, middle powers are using their diplomatic agility, their economic leverage, and their regional influence to redefine how global politics works. They're reviving multilateralism by building new coalitions across the global north and south. They're acting as both stabilizers and disruptors depending upon the moment and the region, and they're pursuing strategic autonomy, asserting control over trade, resources, and foreign policy in a deeply polarized world. And that's the key insight here. In an age of renewed great power rivalry, it's the behavior of middle powers that may determine where we move forward towards cooperation or towards confrontation. The United States, China, and Russia still dominate the headlines, but increasingly the real action, the negotiations, the innovation, the friction, and the diplomacy is happening in the space in between. If the 20th century was defined by bipolarity and the 21st century of American unipolarity, then the next chapter may belong to the middle powers, not because they're the most powerful, but because they might just be the most essential. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Global Insights. If you found this analysis helpful, or if it gave you a new way to think about global politics, go ahead and give it a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future episodes. But before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Can middle powers truly remain independent in today's polarized world, or are they still at the mercy of the great powers? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, and I read every one. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.